Last week, we started looking at some of these writers, these non-Christian writers, these hostile writers. Of course, we did finish up looking at some arguments that may be given with regard to the historical nature. The one we really looked at was the former Lutheran atheist, now atheist, by the name of Judith Hayes, who wrote a book, In God We Trust, but which one? In which she expressed doubts of the historical nature. And one of the arguments that Brother Wayne Jackson, in an article dealing with this book on the Christian Courier website, on the Christian Courier publication, periodical, was that here's 20 writers from ancient times around that time, and none of them mentioned Christ. And yet we pointed out that there were at least 5 on the list that did in some fashion. And then we also noted that some, based upon their writing, what they wrote, their topics, would have definitely had no reason to really broach the idea of Jesus Christ. For example, Arian, who was a Greek historian, who was born 65 years after the death of Christ, what was his writing? His most famous writing was a history of Alexander the Great. Well, how do you tie in a history of Alexander the Great when he lived some 330 so years, over 300 years before Christ? You just really don't. So then we start looking at these hostile writers, and the first one we looked at, and the only one we looked at last week, was Tacitus, Cornelius Tacitus, born around AD 56, died sometime after 117 AD. Something known by some as the greatest Roman historian. He lived through the reigns of at least six emperors, noted for 2 writings, the Annals, 18 books that deal with the empire from Augustus to Nero, and then his second writing was the histories that went from the death of Nero to Domitian in AD 96. In his book number 15, section 44 of the Annals, and I was telling Sister Gloria, I said, one of the things I like about these writings is most of the stuff I'm talking about are in the public domain, meaning I can access it on my computer, on my tablet, and I can copy and paste, and I don't have to try to type things out looking at a book or something like that because, hey, it's in the public domain. It's available. I don't have to spend money on it. I like that. So we looked at it. It talks about the fire and what did he do. And, historically, you run some people, Nero is blamed for the fire around that time. After the fire was, historians today doubt that Nero actually was responsible for the fire, but they blamed him. One argument, of course, we always hear this, is what did Nero do? Well, I didn't say this last week, but what did Nero do supposedly while Rome burned? Well, what's the phrase though? Nero fiddled. You say, well, Rome burned. And people say, well, Nero didn't actually fiddle. He actually had a lyre or a harp. That's what he actually played. But you know how sometimes things get changed, wording, because it sounds a little better. So it may have sounded better. So just the fact that the wrong instrument is used in that popular phrase doesn't necessarily mean that Nero wasn't responsible, but there is some evidence there. But again, even if he wasn't responsible, he was blamed for it, was he not? By many. And so what did he try to do? Well, what was his plan? Find scapegoats. Who can we blame it on? So he blamed it upon Christians, and so he persecuted and tortured Christians. And this is again what Tacitus wrote. Therefore, to scotch the rumor, meaning that he had been responsible for the fire, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find a vogue. First, then, the confessed members of the sect were arrested. Next, on their disclosures, vast numbers were convicted, not so much on the count of arson as for hatred of the human race. And derision accompanied their end. They were covered with wild beast skins and torn to death by dogs, or they were fastened on crosses, and when daylight fell, were burned to serve as lamps by night. Nero had offered his garden for the spectacle and gave an exhibition in his circus, mixing with the crowd in the habit of the charioteer or mounted on his car. Hence, in spite of a guilt which had earned the most exemplary punishment, there arose a sentiment of pity due to the impression that they were being sacrificed not for the welfare of the state, but to the ferocity of a single man. And we sometimes worry about our rulers in this country, don't we? That was one thing I'll just say, that if you'll allow. One thing about Brock Shanks, when he preached on that Tuesday night of the gospel meeting, you really go back and we read this, the Old Testament accounts. Even the nation of Israel and Judah, boy, they had some really, 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 really bad kings. Really bad. Well, Nero might have fit in. But it's interesting because some might say, well, Tacitus was writing this from history. He maybe got some from annals, but he probably talked to some people, and these people had it in for Nero. Well, notice what we find through Tacitus, his writing. What does he think of Christians? He does not like them. And what do you generally do if you're trying to make someone look bad? Like in a situation like this, what would you probably think about? Whom would he be persecuting? Well, what type of person, we might say? The kindest persons, the nicest people, the goodliest people. Why would that Nero was so mean-spirited. Here were these people who didn't do any harm to him, and he persecuted them. That's true. That's the truth. But that's not what Tacitus says, what? These people that he did were the scum of the earth, is what he called Christians. They were terrible. They were horrible. But Nero was bad enough that people felt sorry for him. So Tacitus may have exaggerated somewhat, may have. I don't believe so. At least not very much. I believe what we find here is very reasonable, especially when we note that tradition holds at least what two apostles died around the time of Nero's reign. Peter and Paul. Both of them died around the mid-60s. And Nero died, I think, 66, 67, 66. But so they were caught up in this by tradition, And so it's a very bad situation. But what do we note in here? And we point out a few things. First of all, he noted that Christians were named for whom? For Christ, for Christus, from the Latin. Noted that this Christus was put to death when? Here's where it gets, as a historian, it gets really good though, because what does he do? He's not making some, I believe he got put to death. What does he do? He gives specifics, doesn't he? Tiberius, Pontius Pilate. So if the Roman bureaucratic archives were as well kept as people think, someone may have been able to go do what? Look this up. May have been able to look this up. Again, refers a lot to the history of Christianity, because he mentions where does this begin? Judea. And then they carried the doctrine to Rome. And of course, they were guilty of vices, and they were abominations and hatred of mankind. And what things did they do? Well, they worship one God. That's just wacky. And supposedly they were cannibals, and you can find some other things in the writings. But then, well, again, they were burned to death, they were nailed to the cross, and yet what did this do? It brought up sympathy for these people. But one of the great things he did was he linked Jesus Christ to Tiberius Caesar to Pontius Pilate. And so while some may say the only time we really should read of Pontius Pilate is in the gospel accounts. We talked about Pontius Pilate last week. We talked about him a couple weeks, a little bit, Here we have a Roman historian saying that he was the procurator when this occurred. Second thing he did mention in the histories, his book Histories, which most has been lost, and this appears to have been as a reference in another writing later. So someone quoted this as like people do today, don't they? They quote things and they put in footnotes or in a bibliography or something like that. But he referenced the idea of the burning of Jerusalem, especially the temple, with the idea that the religion of the Jews and the Christians might more thoroughly be subverted. For these religions, although contrary to each other, had nevertheless proceeded from the same authors, that the Christians had sprung up from among the Jews. So if this did come from Tacitus' writings, then it does give the idea that he had some awareness of events outside of Rome. But of course, why was he aware of what was going on in Judea? Was because who was involved? Well, you had the Jews, of course, in Jerusalem, but you also had whom? The Romans, the Roman army. So it's not necessarily too much of a stretch to think that a big event like that would have caught. And like I said, the Jews and the Romans were against each other for a number of years, and starting around 66 AD or so, that's when the Jews really began their revolt against the Romans, which led to the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, so the next one we're going to mention is Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus. Suetonius is what we'll call him. Very little is known about him. He was the chief secretary of the Emperor Hadrian around AD 117 to 138. Generally, his writings we see a reference maybe in the early 120s, but he was chief secretary at some point during Hadrian's reign. As secretary then of the emperor, he would have access to the imperial records. He also could have talked to some witnesses that may have been around, but chances are some of it was references. In his Life of Claudius, section 25, he wrote, he banished from Rome all the Jews who were continually making disturbances at the instigation of one Chrestus. Okay, and then his second reference is in the Life of Nero, book 16. Many severe regulations and new orders were made in his time. A sumptuary law was enacted. Public suppers were limited to the sportulae, and victualling, houses restrained from any dressed victuals except pulse and herbs, whereas before they had sold all kinds of meat. He likewise inflicted punishments on the Christians, a sort of people who held a new and impious superstition. So from these two passages, what can we pull out? First of all, he references the expulsion of the Jews from Rome during the period of Claudius. Well, what does that support? The Bible. Acts chapter 18, verse 2. When Paul came to Corinth after leaving Athens, and he began making tents while in Corinth, and while making tents, he came upon a couple by the name of Aquila and Priscilla. Well, why were they in Corinth? Well, it appears they had previously been in Rome until what? Till the banishment of the Jews by what emperor? By Claudius. And so Suetonius here gives support to what Luke wrote. Now, by what did Suetonius say who was causing the instigation? The name is written as Chrestus, and so some would believe that this is just a misspelling, of Christus. Now, it could be, I guess it could have been some Jew by the name of Chrestus. I'm not going to sit there and deny that. But let's say, though, that it is a misspelling, a miswriting, that Christus is actually Chrestus, and that the Chrestus is the same one that was written about by Tacitus. This casting out occurred near 50 AD or so, late 40s AD. Jesus died around 30 AD. So how did this Chrestus, if it is the Christ, cause an instigation? But was it by himself? Did Jesus actually appear? No, that's not what it is. What it very obviously could represent would be what? The teaching of Christ. Well, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Well, go to the book of Acts, look at the first missionary journey. What happened with Paul and Barnabas? Who got stirred up by their preaching? A number of the Jews, did they not? How about the second missionary journey? Well, the Thessalonians, the Jews ran Paul out of Thessalonica, and so they went to Berea. And what happened then? The Bereans, the Jews were more noble, but the Jews came down there from Thessalonica to come after Paul. And so that's why Paul went to Athens. These Jews were getting stirred up, what? At the preaching of Christ. And you go to Corinth, one of the more interesting passages, Paul is actually brought up before the ruler, the judge. Before Paul's about to make a decision, they say something, and he says, "No, I'm kicking this out." And then what did the Greeks do to the chief ruler, Sosthenes? They beat the tar out of him. I always found that to be really interesting. That's what these Greeks were. These Greeks said, "You're causing trouble, people." And who was it? Jew. So the Jews had a tendency to get riled up when Christ was being preached, did they not? And so it's quite possible that they got riled up when it was getting riled up when Christ was being preached in Rome. And what did Claudius decide? I don't know who's at fault here. I'll solve it. Maybe while we don't have it in writing, it may have looked like it was some kind of inner Jewish thing, because we realized that for a time people just thought these Christians were a sect of the Jews. But what might he have decided? I'm not trying to figure out who's right or wrong. All of you can leave. So it does appear, though, that if Christus, we know that he personally wasn't there, but his teachings were and would be preached. And that could be the reason for this instigation. But then also note, what does Suetonius say later with the period of Nero? So that when Nero indicted punishments, he was a little less verbose about this than Tacitus was. But he did say they were a sort of people who held a impious or mischievous might be another way of wording it, superstition, religion, belief. So did Suetonius really seem to care for Christians either? Based upon the way he worded that, I would say no. And again, he refers to them as Christians. And that gives support to the idea they were named after one Jesus Christ, one Christus. So, Suetonius doesn't say much, but he does, in one of his passages, he gives support to what Luke wrote. And maybe gives us a little better understanding of why the Jews were asked to leave Rome, because Christ was being preached and it stirred up troubles, and these troubles Claudius said, like I said, I don't know if this is exactly, but all you leave. Just all of you get out. I'm not going to try to figure out who's right or who's wrong. So Suetonius mentions it a couple times. The next one we're going to mention is Pliny the Younger, called such because he had a relative who was also known as Bob the Younger. No. I've been wanting to do that for a couple weeks now. No, it's Pliny the Elder. This was his, actually it was his uncle. Pliny the Younger was actually the nephew of Pliny the Elder, and then he was actually the adopted son. He was an author, an administrator who was sent by the Roman Emperor Trajan to the region of Bithynia in AD 110-111 as governor. Bithynia was actually mentioned in the New Testament, in the book of Acts. Anybody remember the circumstances? This is sort of a side note, but helps us maybe with our Bible knowledge. Paul had gotten to Troas, and he wanted to go to Bithynia, but God forbid him. And then later in the dream, what did Paul receive? The vision to go to Macedonia, the Macedonian call. So while Paul did not get to Bithynia, we will discover that this did not mean that the church had not reached Bithynia, because at some point Christians were there, because Pliny is the governor, and he wrote a number of letters. He wrote a number of books of letters, and at least 10 of these books have survived. In his 10th book, letter number 96, he makes reference to a group known as Christians, and again, he's writing to the Emperor Trajan. And when you get the background, you sort of you understand that the Christian influence was strong enough in this area, this region, that the pagan temples were nearly deserted. The pagan festivals had diminished in attendance, and that the sacrificial animals that were to be sold for these festivals weren't getting bought. Sounds like a very similar situation that we found in Ephesus in Acts chapter 19. Remember the silversmiths, Demetrius the silversmith led a group of silversmiths against Paul and the church. Why? Because all these people were converting over to Christianity, and so they were getting rid of their books of magic. Remember that, the books of sorcery. But they also weren't buying the little idols and images of Diana. And so what did that mean to their pocketbooks? It hurt the pocketbooks as much as any kind of religious issue. It hurt because it was a silversmith, and we make these things. So we see that history does appear to be repeating itself, at least in this area. Let me read, I've highlighted a few parts. I won't read all of the letter, but some of it's a little lengthy, but he's writing for assistance and advice on how to deal with these Christians. I've never been present in any legal examination of the Christians, and I do not know, therefore, what are the usual penalties passed upon them, or the limit of those penalties, or how searching an inquiry may be made. So he's asking, he's saying, these Christians are brought up to question them about their faith. Do they believe? Do they not believe? I don't know exactly what's going on, although I've heard some things, and so I'm trying to get better help. So whether if they renounce their faith, they should be pardoned, or whether the man who has once been a Christian should gain nothing by recanting. Whether the name itself, even though otherwise innocent of crime, should be punished, or only the crimes that gather around it. So if one renounces being a Christian, should their crimes be pardoned, or should it just nothing, they recanted, but still. And then the idea is, if they come up with somebody who is a Christian, but they don't have anything to hold them, what they haven't really done, what have they done? Nothing. But they're called a Christian. If one suffers as a Christian, as Paul said, just maybe having the name of Christian, should they be punished? Or only should the crimes be punished should they be punished if they've actually committed some sort of crime? In the meantime, this is a plan which I've adopted in the case of those Christians who've been brought before me. I ask them whether they are Christians. If they say yes, and I repeat the question a second or third time, warning of the penalties it entails, and if they still persist, I order them to be taken away to prison. So he gives those who are calling themselves Christians what? Opportunity to do what? To denounce Christ, to denounce their faith, to recant. And he says 3 times. And if they don't do that, then they get cast into prison. Again, Peter seemed to be understanding what was going on, understood what was going to go on, didn't he, when he wrote that? Then he goes, those who deny that they were or had been Christians, and called upon the gods in the usual formula, reciting the words after me, those who offered incense and wine before your image, which I've given orders to be brought forward for this purpose, together with the statues of the deities, all such I consider should be discharged, especially as they curse the name of Christ, which it says those who are really Christians cannot be induced to do. I didn't realize, I read this and thought this, but I thought this even more. Pliny may have been a Calvinist. If they really were Christians, they couldn't do that. Well, they shouldn't do that. If they really believe, they wouldn't do that. But it's not because they can't. They can't fall. They've just developed a strong enough faith and belief that they won't. And notice what he said, curse the name of whom? Christ. So here we have a reference to Christ. Others, whose names were given to me by an informer, first said that they were Christians and afterward denied it, declaring that they had been, were so no longer, some of them having recanted many years before, and more than one so long as 20 years back. That's what happens when you don't update these lists, isn't it? These roles need to be updated, don't they? I think that's the lesson here. No. But you can just picture, can you not? You've been accused of being a Christian. I haven't been a Christian for 20 years, For 10 years, I haven't been a Christian. Sounds like their faith wasn't that strong, They all worshiped your image in the statues of the deities, your image being the emperors, Trajan at this time. But note, again, remember, the emperors were considered to be gods. And the statues of the deities, and cursed the name of Christ again. But they declared the sum of their guilt, or their only amounted to this, that on a stated day they had been accustomed to meet before daybreak, and to recite a hymn among themselves to Christ, as though he were a god, and that so far from binding themselves by oath to commit any crime, their oath was to abstain from theft, robbery, adultery, and from breach of faith, and not to deny trust money, placed in their keeping when called upon to deliver it. When this ceremony was concluded, it had been their custom to depart and meet again to take food, but it was of no special character and quite harmless, and they had ceased this practice after the edict in which, in accordance with the orders, I had forbidden all secret societies. I thought it more to find out truth was in these statements by submitting two women to the torture, but I found nothing but a debased superstition carried to great lengths. Notice what he then says, for the contagion of this superstition has spread not only through the free cities, but into the villages and the rural districts, and yet it seems to me that it can be checked and set right. So, of course, what does history show with regard to Pliny the Younger? He was wrong on that last statement, was he not? So what can we learn from this writing? Well, this Christ was worshipped as deity by those who believed. He was worshipped as deity. The teachings of Christ and his followers, they were referred to as debased, excessive, contagious superstition. So again, what kind of do we see if you ask Pliny the Younger, what do you think about Christianity? Yay or nay? What's he going to say? Nay. Does not find it favorable. So here's another hostile witness. Would recite an oath or make statement when they met regarding things they would not do, such as robbery, adultery, breach of faith. There may have been reference to the Lord's Supper, but possibly more to such maybe the love feast that we found mentioned in 1 Corinthians by Paul. I say that because they said they stopped it. Well, if they stopped us all gathering together for afternoon lunch, that's one thing, is it not? Because we can all eat our lunches at our homes. But what should the Christian do with regard to the Lord's Supper? Assemble down the first week and partake of it. So if they were true believers, and these, again, you run this, they would not have done such. But it does appear to be some reference to what we do find mentioned in the New Testament, maybe with regard to these love feasts, on a stated or certain day. So this may have been a reference to them meeting on the first day of the week, the Lord's Day, what we would call Sunday today. Pliny does reference those who ended up denying Christ, but again, he notes that the true believer would not worship the gods or the emperor, which sounds reasonable, does it not? For a Christian, service was before dawn. What might this allow? Why might they have met, especially on the first day of the week, why would they have met before dawn? That's the time that Christ arose, possibly. What might be a more secular reason? They had to work. They had jobs. They were, if they were slaves, especially. What were they? I'm taking off. You got to be out from 9 to 2. Give me a couple of, Again, that might be also why they met at night when Paul spoke to the church at Troas. Because they had to work. They didn't have blue laws. They had to fit in the time when they could assemble. And when could they assemble? Before or after? Oh, boy, that sounds tough. Well, you know what? I'll tell you what. A lot of college, Division I college teams, especially like basketball teams, a lot of times, you know when they get up to meet? They'll have their practice before 6 o'clock, before the start of the day, because they got classes if they go to class. No, that's another story. Classes and other things, you know. So we meet before. No one is meeting at 5 a.m. for a class. If there's a professor out there that would get up at 5 a.m. for a class, tenure would be rejected immediately for him. I can tell you that. So this, and it also references they sang hymns. The singing of hymns was referenced. So while there's not a specific reference we would say to Christ being the founder, we do see the reference with regard to Christ being worshiped, but also Christ being denied. So what does that tell us? This Christ must have been important to these people. And even the Romans had figured out there was some importance to this. Why? Because those who appeared to have been believers would not deny him, but those who recanted and didn't want to get punished would do what? Deny Christ. And again, why? Because he was being worshipped as deity. And so there's some good information in this writing here with regard to the early church, with regard to things they believed, and with regard to the sufferings that they did face. They were facing punishment. We'll stop here. We'll pick up. I want to read the reply letter from Trajan, which is letter number 97 in book 10. And then we'll look at a couple others. Celsus and Lucian, and maybe there might be one other. And then we'll probably not next week, but at some point we'll be looking at Josephus. So thanks so much for your attention tonight and comments, and greatly appreciate it.